afternoon, everyone. My name is Swati Prakash, and it is my very great pleasure to welcome you all to this afternoon's conversation about social justice, mindfulness, and the law. I'm a third-year student here at Berkeley Law, and for the past 2 years I've been involved with the student-run Berkeley Law Mindfulness Group as a co-coordinator. And I'm just thrilled that the Berkeley Initiative on Mindfulness and Law, the Henderson Center for Social Justice, and the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society are co-sponsoring this fantastic talk by Professor John Powell and Tyrion Steinbach from the East Bay Community Law Center. They'll both be speaking on a topic that I think is of enormous relevance, certainly for all of us in the room who are law students, but more broadly for the practice of law in general, and I think for those of us in the room who aren't law students. So what I actually want to do to get us started in the spirit of today's topic on mindfulness is invite us to join together in an actual brief moment of mindful stillness. And this will give us an opportunity to let go of the busyness, of the bustle of this morning, and just focus on being here together in this room and in this particular moment. And so I'll invite everyone, if you're seated, and I know some people are standing or sitting on the floor, to just maybe close your laptops and put down whatever might be in your hand. This will just take a minute or two. And focus on just taking a very upright posture so that you'll be alert and with your spine as straight as possible. Your feet, if you're seated or standing, just planted firmly on the floor. So if you're sitting in a seat, you might try to sit at the front edge of your seat so that you're not leaning or slouching back, and this helps your spine stay straight. You can maybe bring your shoulders up and back and down so that your chest stays erect. And your hands can stay folded in your lap or on your knees. If you're standing, just at your side and focus on distributing your weight evenly on your feet. Keep your feet about hips with distance apart. And we'll try to remain as still as possible for a minute or two, knowing that a still body can help our minds become still. And what we'll do is just focus on the feel and the sound of our breath entering and leaving our lungs. And so when I ring this bell, if you're comfortable letting your eyes close, please do so. Or you can just fix your eyes on one place and let them stay quietly there. So we're just focusing on our breath and on our normal breathing, the feel and the sound of our breath entering and leaving our lungs. If you become aware of any tense places in your body, in the neck or the shoulders, the jaw or the stomach, just focus your awareness on that place and invite the muscles there to relax. If you find that thoughts or emotions or sounds from the corridor draw your attention away from your breath and from the present moment, that's totally normal. Just gently draw your attention back to your breath and to your body, as many times as it takes. So we'll just sit for a moment or two more, and when you hear the sound of the bell, open your eyes. Thank you. And thank you once again for being here. I'm going to invite Charlie Halpern from the Berkeley Initiative on Mindfulness and Law to join me up here in introducing our speakers.
Thank you, Swati, and thank you all for joining together in this special way that we have in the mindfulness world, where we come together in silence, with focus, with deliberately gathering our attention and bringing it into the room. And if you find yourself during the course of the program with your mind wandering, as it sometimes might, bring it back. Gently bring your attention back to the present moment, back to your breath, back to our wonderful presenters. John Powell is someone who I have known of for many decades. He was an important leader, a visionary leader in civil rights, civil liberties. For a period of time, he was the national legal director of the American Civil Liberties Union. And he's been one of the leaders who has drawn from his own deep spiritual well springs to bring that energy into his social justice work. And at the Berkeley Initiative for Mindfulness and Law, we're very interested in how social justice and mindfulness and the deep spiritual roots that mindfulness flows from in many different traditions can be merged together to create a kind of social justice activism that is appropriate to the 21st century. No one is better equipped to address these questions than John Powell, and I'm delighted to introduce him to you. I've asked to provide us with some comments after John's talk is finished. I've asked Tyrion Steinbach, who many of you know as the executive director of the East Bay Community Law Center, and another person who has a deep meditation practice going back many years. Because John and I have the advantage in years, we can say that our practice goes back many decades, but Tyrion is another person who has brought this meditation work together with her deep commitment to social justice. And she'll provide some comments on John's remarks. And then we'll have time for discussion. And I just want to call your attention to John's new book, Racing to Justice, Transforming Our Conceptions of Self and Other to Build an Inclusive Society. And at the end of the talk, John has agreed to sign copies for anyone who wants to purchase a copy of the book. Without more, John Powell.
Thank you, Charlie. I'm just going to try to cover this a little bit if I can. Okay, good. So it's a delight to be here. I see friendly friends in the audience, and some of my students who are also rapidly becoming friends, and all of the new friends. And as Charlie said, I've known Charlie and known of his work for many decades, and he's funded this work in the past, and he's been one of the leaders, and of course helping to bring this here to Berkeley. He's really doing really a wonderful thing for you, for Berkeley, and for the country. So I'm going to ground the talk to some extent in really trying to situate where we are. So by that I mean, you can think of this as both a practice but also a critique of a deeper understanding of where we are. In terms of doing that, to some extent, this is a talk that's really will take us back to the Enlightenment Project. And I'm sure all of you woke up this morning and said, you know, I'm tired of this Enlightenment Project. So I'm going to help you in that effort. So when we think about the self, in some way we talk about many aspects of the Enlightenment Project. And there's that period of time where we had the Reformation and then the Renaissance. And sort of in the heart of that is the Enlightenment Project itself that came out of the Renaissance and Reformation. And so when we talk about the self, we're actually grounding it in a deep understanding, actually not even understanding because we don't think about it, just experience many of the foundations of what I call the Enlightenment Project. And I was talking to someone recently, they said, why do you call it a project? Because that's what it was, and like many projects, I think it's coming to an end. And the people who were in the heyday of it, it was like the new world, you know, the end of history, and reality, all those things, those heady things that suggested that it was more than a project. And as a project, it did some good things, and it also did some things that were not so good. And we're always in process, so someday someone may be looking back at us and say, you know, what about that mindful project or whatever, as they sort of go on to the next thing. And also I want to sort of think about this both in terms of the meaning of social justice, but also the way it can change the way we experience issues around social justice. And this is particularly important, you know, when we think about where we are, both in our everyday life and in the practice of law, and how all these things relate to our structures, the way we experience the law school or our places where we work or reside. So one of the questions, of course, is how do we get here? And we'll talk about where is the here. About the here in terms of modernity, here in terms of late modernity, and even what I would call the sort of dissolution of the Enlightenment project. And one way of thinking about it is that, you know, we started off, at least in terms of Western history, and this is about Western history, and obviously we're in the West, but also the dominance of Western history goes beyond the West now. It sort of extends around the world. So not saying that there are not other expressions, and we'll at least touch on some of those, but we'll be grounding this talk in terms of the Western expression where the Enlightenment came out of. And so before the Enlightenment project, it's appropriate that we have, before we have light, we have darkness. So we have the Dark Ages. And some of you know Max Weber, he talked about the Enlightenment project, one of its underbellies, as creating a disenchanted world. And I say to my students, so before the world was disenchanted, what was it? Enchanted, right? Of course, the people who were in that period didn't experience the world as enchanted, they just experienced it as, this is the world. But it's a world actually built a lot around spirituality, or at least religion. The most important institution was the Catholic Church. Contemplation was actually, in some form, embraced publicly. It was a high aspiration. And it was also a period where there wasn't much in the way of science. There was a way where people's lives were circumscribed. They had the whole idea of what's called the great chain of being. That is, we were ordered in the universe, and everyone had an order, everyone had a place. And the role of a good society was to know your place, and not to try to rise above your place or below your place. And then something happened, and all of a sudden we got a space needle. So how do we get from the Dark Ages to the space needle? And again, so we talk about the Enlightenment project that actually helped us do that. So some of the things it gave us that, and I don't want to throw all these things under the bus, but I want to, in a sense, talk about them and problematize them. One, of course, is rationality and knowledge. And of course, also the idea of the self. All of those things were things that gave us, given us to us in the Enlightenment project. So in a sense, you could say all these things have a history. Knowledge has a history, the sense of self has a history, and rationality has a history. And for many of us, that doesn't make sense. We think of just you're rational, you're not. It's not something that we can locate in a historical moment. And of course we can. And these ideas were also bound up with the scientific revolution. And so science was the hard edge of all these things. And what that meant in some ways is that other disciplines actually tried to mimic science. Everyone wanted to be a physicist. You know, they were the real rational people, and they knew knowledge. And so in some sense, it was the aspiration of all the social sciences to actually mimic the science. So the Enlightenment, in a sense, became sort of inspired by science. And the hope was that we could eventually know everything. And one way of thinking about the Enlightenment project, its aspiration, is that you could shine a light so bright that there would be no darkness. To put it a different way, eventually we know everything. Everything was knowable, and eventually we know everything. And so, in that sense, it was trying to root out the darkness. And law. So will also be informed by the Enlightenment. we'll see in a minute. So try to imagine, light without darkness. And of course, we have certain philosophers who later basically says, one of my favorite, Gadamer, who says, everything that reveals also conceals. So the idea that we could have knowledge without darkness, that we have light without darkness, Gadamer rejects that. The very foundation of knowledge presupposes not knowing. But that was the aspiration. And out of that aspiration, we actually defined what it meant to be human. So a person that was fully human was a person that was fully rational. And so it's not surprising, when I was in law school, we talked a lot about the reasonable man. And it was a man. And I'm saying he was reasonable, but it definitely was a man. And we would even go further and say it's a white man. And then we didn't say white man. We said it's a European man. We could say it was a Protestant man. We could say it's a Christian man. We could say a lot of things about this universal man that in law school and courts we say, what would the reasonable man do? It's like, who cares, you know? And of course we say, we're not interested in women because they're not that reasonable. We're not interested in children, they're not that reasonable. Slaves, of course they're not reasonable. Indians, they're not reasonable. And so that's what we saw being constructed through law and through reasoning was that there's this natural place of humans, this natural place where sophisticated, mature humans resided. And everyone who didn't fit into that was not fully human. And in a sense, as we loosen these chains, these other groups were invited to aspire to become fully human, so to become like a reasonable man. And to some extent, those assumptions still live with us. What was not seen is that this self, this Hobbesian self, and if you read Hobbes today, most of us don't spend time with Leviticus, but if you read Hobbes today, he would sound like a paranoid schizophrenic. So before there was civil society, we were in a constant state of war. Everyone against everyone else. Everyone wants my stuff. And so we enter into civil society so that society will protect us from each other. Oh, but wait a minute, there's a problem. Who's going to protect us from society that's supposed to protect us from each other? And this is Hobbes, who is sort of considered the father of modern political thought. And in a sense, this sort of deep fear. So the other is something to be afraid of. The other is after you. So, I mean, you think about, when we talk about not just undocumented populations, we talk about illegal aliens. And we might as well say dangerous illegal aliens. So it sounds like a bad science fiction movie. You know, we got invaded by illegal, dangerous aliens. So the sort of deep fear of the other is bounded up in the sense of self. The self is cut off. The self is isolated. And the way the self deals with this isolation and separation is control. You want to dominate those things that you don't understand. And what don't you understand? Well, the group that I just named, women, children, slaves, Native Americans, nature. We all enjoy parks, but we feel different about the forest. And so think about children's stories. How many terrible things happen when you go into the forest, right? Because the forest is not controllable. It sort of runs beyond us, if you will. And these things are not just the way that actually form who we are. They form how we actually construct society. They form how we construct institutions and the law. Someone noticed, for example, that since the 1960s, before the 1960s, many of porches were built in the front, so people could see each other. Most homes built after that, porches were built in the back, so that you can actually go for years without having to interact with your neighbor. And to some people, this is a wonderful thing. I was looking at a job in Dallas that I didn't take, and this was years ago, and someone said, I said, so how is it living here? They said, it's great, no one ever bothers you. I've lived here for 10 years, I don't even know my neighbors. So this would make Hobbes feel really good. So in a sense, this is what I'm writing against. This is what I'm talking against. And these things, objectivity, neutrality, the sort of mechanical nature of the world without enchantment, is what this gives us. And it shows up in law. It shows up in terms of the law's aspiration and the way the court aspires, and even the way the court defines the self and the others. The way we think about public versus private, nature versus the state. And so you have people like Clarence Thomas and others talking about, well, you know, so if people segregate themselves, it may not be caused by any human intentionality, it's just nature. It's just things that happen naturally. And when that happens, there's not much for the court to do. Or you have Justice O'Connor talking about causation, and the fact that causation under an enlightenment project is linear. One thing causes the next thing, causes the next thing. It's very predictable, it's very logical, it's very linear. And again, so we think of law in this way. We think of, and so when we look at problems that are messy, that where causations are multiple and moving in different directions, the court essentially oftentimes throws those things out. It's like it's too messy. We don't know how to deal with that. And the aspiration for the court and justices is to be umpires. And this is Justice Roberts. You know, he said, we just call balls and strikes. Sometimes we call it affirmative action, sometimes we call it, you know, voting rights, but these are just balls and strikes. And we're neutral. We're not, there's no personal inflection in what we do. We're just judges. And people don't, you know, as it says, people don't go to the game to see the umpire. You know, so the real stuff is happening out here. We're just neutral arbitrators. And how do we know what people want to do? How do we know how people behave? Well, people are aware of themselves, at least real people. The reasonable man is aware of his intentions, is aware of his motivation. So the law gets built up around intent. And the intent doctrine, which is read into the 14th Amendment, is there segregation? Did someone intend for it to be segregation? We don't know. If no intention, no segregation. Now obviously it's not true in all aspects of the law. You have torts, you have, but those becomes the exception. But in terms of constitutional law, we sort of build the intent doctrine around a sense of a person who is aware of his or her acts. And increasingly we know that this is not who people are. That none of us are aware of ourselves in the way that the Enlightenment Project suggests that we would be. And this is the way we think of institutions. We order institutions in a very discrete way, very intentionally. What do we intend when we create that school? What do we intend when we create that housing? Not what is the school doing? Not what is the housing doing? Instead of looking at what the institutions and structures are doing, we look at the intent behind the institutions and structures. We also have the whole notion of we don't like groups, and at least we actually, the law wants to organize itself around individuals. And groups, people who organize themselves in groups automatically become others. So if you go back and read some of the early cases in terms of taking that Native American land, one of the justification was they held it in the wrong way. What's the wrong way? They held it as a group. Well, no one does that. At least no reasonable person does that. And so literally the court allowed the taking of land and giving it to reasonable people, which meant giving it to white men. And so the whole notion of how we allocate resources is based on, again, sort of this project. Now the Other Project is huge in law. Who belongs and who doesn't belong? We've already talked about the illegal alien. Well, probably illegal alien doesn't belong. I mean, there's a hint in that phraseology that suggests that a person doesn't belong. And I would say, when a person doesn't belong, it doesn't mean they don't belong in society. It means they don't belong within the circle of human concern. They're not fully human. They're not selves in the way that the Enlightenment Project talks about it. And so when you read Justice Taney's now infamous opinion in Dred Scott, he described blacks as never able to belong. Never able to belong. And he's clear, right? Free or otherwise. It doesn't matter if they're slave or not. They can never belong to a political community. And in a sense, you could say the march in terms of law in the United States has been trying to see who belongs and what does it mean to belong. And we're still, in many ways, fighting that question of belongingness. So the law is about belonging. And you have people some would say, we structure this society. So Samuel Huntington has written a book called, it says, Who Are We? Interesting title. But he answers the question in the book, and I strongly recommend that you don't buy it. Which you might read in the library. But basically what he says is that we got to stop calling ourselves an immigrant society. He says we are a settler society. The country was settled by certain people. And anyone else that comes have to adhere to the settlers' ideals. Now who are the settlers, Huntington? He says they're Protestant. They're Anglos and they're Saxons. So those of you, if you're not Anglo-Saxon, you're not as part of the settler group. They're English-speaking. They're hard-working. If he'd written the book 15 years ago, he would have said they're white. He doesn't say they're white, but he describes all, as close as he can get. I mean, I don't know any Anglos or Saxons that are not considered white. But anyway, and he's saying there's some people who come into the country and they're not behaving consistent with these values. They don't learn the language. They have different religions. He says we shouldn't be ashamed to tell them that they don't belong and invite them to leave. So he's a fairly serious writer at Harvard. And he's given voice to something that a lot of people actually are feeling. Again, we're talking about the self. We're talking about how the self is constructed and how it shows up in law. But we're talking beyond that as well. We're talking about how it shows up in us. Our own experience of separation, isolation. And sometimes when we try to connect, it's clumsy because we don't have structures, we don't have institutions, we don't have language to actually help us connect. And so it becomes a very difficult job. We've learned, we have deep habits built into our structure, built into our language, built into our being of not connecting, of being afraid of the other. And yet we have an impulse to connect. Because I think, in fact, I would argue that we are connected. It's not something we have to create. It's actually something we have to celebrate, we have to acknowledge, and then we have to build something around it. So, the self and the other. I want to suggest to you that there is no other. And if that doesn't, get you thinking, I want to go a little further and suggest that there's no other and there's no self. But the construction of the self and other is a structure that splits us apart, splits us off from ourselves. So as we otherize people, we're actually fragmenting ourselves. So as we put the apparent self in the middle of the circle and the apparent other outside of the circle, it's like putting part of our body outside and part of our body inside. It's like trying to police ourselves in a way. We're at war, not, as Hobbes suggests, with all the other individuals. We're at war with ourselves. So part of the anxiety that comes from the Enlightenment Project is not just an anxiety about the imagined other, it's an anxiety about us. It's an anxiety about our very being. And so part of the effort is to heal this split. And I want to suggest that mindfulness is the way to actually approach this. But in a funny way, it doesn't have to heal it because it doesn't exist, right? It's an imagined space. You have to just become aware that it's an imagined space. It's like the old adage that you don't have to get the snake that's under your bed. You don't have to root out the snake. You just have to realize it's a rope. There never was a snake, even though we organized it being around the snake. Kill that snake. How are we going to kill the snake? We don't have to kill it. It's not a snake. So I want to suggest, and I can't put it on here, that our connectivity is powerful, is there. And more and more that we're seeing, not just through mindfulness, but through other traditions, including some of the stuff that's coming out of the mind science, suggests the profound way that we are interconnected. So part of the thing then, in terms of the circle of human concern, is that, in a sense, the more we have in the circle, the more possibility we have for living a whole and full life. And I think what Swati, who's helping me with this PowerPoint, challenged the notion that when you have a circle, you still have something in and something out, right? So isn't a circle by definition creating a boundary between in and out? And boundaries actually always does some work. And Gabor, my friend over here, is an astrophysicist, and he would tell you that the universe is a circle without a boundary. There's nothing outside of the universe. So if you don't believe me, go talk to Gabor afterwards. So part of the thing is to sort of look at where we locate people in the circle and where we isolate people outside the circle. Now, a lot of what I've been talking about may sound philosophical or theoretical or religious or spiritual, but I can say that in terms of the mind science now, we can actually test empirically where groups fall within the circle of humanity. There's a part of the brain that lights up when we see another human being. Not our friend or our family, just another human being. It's, you know, we call it species recognition. And there's the groups that are put outside of the circle of human concern. When we see them, that part of the brain does not light up. We literally don't see them as human. And again, what does that do to them? And what does it do to us? And you might imagine that group would be undocumented immigrants. That group would be ex-offenders. That group would be homeless people. In the past, that group would have been slaves. And who's in that group changes. But that says, again, a lot about both the group and about us. So the hard thing for you, if I can conjecture, the hard thing for you in terms of being here at law school, many of you I know are law students, is that we celebrate the isolated self in law school. And so no wonder some of you may feel like this is an alienating process. And you may or may not know, but I went to Berkeley 1,000 years ago, and there was a rumor about me. I found this place so alienating that I used to walk into the building backwards. I used to walk up the hill backwards. I literally could not face coming into law school. So people had this guy was doing drugs. You know. Literally, someone called the police on me one time. And so my friends said, "You're teaching at Berkeley? I can't believe that." They want to know how do I get in the building. So, in a sense, then, the law school and the law practice takes all of those things from the Enlightenment Project and underscores them in some fundamental ways. And so we need an alternative. We need a way of giving voice to something else. And there's been some efforts. There have been many efforts. But I want to suggest to you that many of the efforts, for example, I'll point out Marxism and humanism, that even as they try to go beyond the Enlightenment Project, they're part of the Enlightenment Project. They still oftentimes are based on many of the same assumptions. And what we're seeing now is things coming, that's challenging the Enlightenment Project that are not just analytics, not just from the social sciences, but are coming from, yes, science itself. And so it suggests, for example, the sort of linearity that we talked about that Newton was so comfortable with. We're not so clear on that anymore. That science is suggesting some kind of complexity in the world that Newton would not have been so happy with. What that suggests to me, and we see it from in terms of the neuroscience, there's a real challenge to the notion of the self that's coming from the neuroscience. And I'll just stop for a moment and give you some numbers. Unless you've already heard this, I want you to throw out what you think these numbers are. And I've always said, if you get the number, you can tell me what these numbers are, you get a really wonderful surprise. I won't tell you what it is, because you're not going to get it. But anyway, so here are 4 numbers. 40, 11 million, 10 to the 80th power, and 10 to the millionth power. 10 to the 80th power is 10 with 80 zeros after it. 10 to the millionth power is 10 with a million zeros after it. So anyone have any sense of what those 4 numbers represent? Anyone other than the board? Okay, well, what do you think they represent?
Well, 10 to the 80 is about the number of protons in the observable universe. You might have been thinking of something else.
You know, it's always one astrophysicist in the crowd. So 40 is the number of number of bits your mind process in a second. 40 bits of information in a second. 11 million is the number of, consciously I should say, the number of bits you consciously process in a second. 11 million is the number of bits you unconsciously process in a second. 11 million, so 11 million things you process in a second, you only be conscious of 40. 10 to the 80th, what I read was that it's the number of atoms in a known universe. So basically. The number of atoms in a known universe, 10 to the 80th power. 10 to the millionth power is the number of computations your brain is capable of making. Most people's brain. So I just throw those numbers out. So we started with 40, and then we look at this incredible capacity of the brain. Most of it's the stuff that happens in your brain will be behind your back. You will not be aware of it consciously. It'll affect the way you think, it'll affect the way you make judgments, it'll affect you in just unimaginable ways. And so when we talk about structures and systems, and brain is one of those, we're looking at a very complex system. We're not looking at linear systems. I'm going to just show you a couple of things. I'm going to talk about another 5 minutes and then stop. The world is not as we see it. The brain is actually creating images. We actually see, so example, when you see this cup, this is actually being processed from several different sites of the brain. The shape, the size, is not, but it's presented to the conscious as a singularity. And so the consciousness is actually being fed stuff by the unconscious. The work in the brain, if you will, has actually happened. Here's one of my favorite. There's about a half a second gap in terms of when we see something and the brain processing it. Half a second. So what that means is that, and we actually fill the gap. We don't like gaps, so the brain fills the gaps. When someone throws a fastball, the batter actually doesn't see the ball. From pitcher release to the hit, hitting the ball. There's not time. There's a gap. But of course he fills it in. And the unconscious actually is processing it, but the conscious can't actually process information that fast. That may sound kind of weird, but think about this. And I like to do these things because when we talk about unconscious, it sounds ridiculous. It sounds like, of course I know myself. And sometimes I go give these talks and people look at me and say, who is this guy from Berkeley that says, you don't even know me? And I always say, you're right, I apologize, but my point is not that I don't know you. My point is that you don't know me. And that's hard to get people to actually come to terms with, because the Enlightenment Project says we do know ourselves. We have access to ourselves. We have complete access to ourselves. And so it takes time to shape people from that. And the process of mindfulness helps us with that. It relaxes. Because, and I'm not going to say a whole lot about this, but a lot of the mindfulness tradition comes from Buddhism. And they don't have, Buddhism wasn't part of the Enlightenment Project. So they don't have the same angst. I'm not saying they don't have angst, but the same angst about wanting to know and be in control of the universe. In a sense, you can think of mindfulness as relaxing into what is, being aware and relaxing into what is. Notice when Swati was actually taking you through that, she says, invite your muscles to relax. That's not what an enlightened person would say. It's like, okay, now make your muscles relax. Make them relax. Are you doing it? Okay. So, what do you see here? Do you see, how would you describe those lines going across the page? Yeah, they look crooked. And of course they're not. They're parallel. I'll give this, you can actually measure it or whatever, but your brain is, because of the way, the other part of the context is distorting how you see the lines, or affecting how you see the lines, I should say. And so the brain is doing stuff like this all the time, and our great luminary from early time, Einstein, recognized that in fact we are connected. And we have this fiction that we're disconnected. And part of it is to come to terms with this fiction. The tradition of being present in a very deliberate and conscious way, and being with that in terms of the world, and what that means in the world, is a tradition that's not just related to Buddhism. It's related almost in every major spiritual and I would say philosophical tradition. So, and I think this is important, and I was talking to Charlie about this, in part because when mindfulness comes up in the United States, and I've been part of this community in various forms for a long time, there are all these tensions. There are racial tensions, there are ethnic tensions. I'm director of the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society. One of the clusters we have is around religion. So we want to look at religion. There's some disturbing things that are happening right now. We're trying to correct them. For example, we're here at Berkeley. We're looking at religion. And right now, everyone, not almost, everyone in the cluster is white. So this is my father and mother. My father is, he's 92 years old now, so he's not practicing anymore. But he's a Christian minister. And in terms of when I think of being mindful and sort of being able to relax into the universe, I can think of no one who have a more profound expression of that than my father. When I think of my family and the idea of interconnectedness, my family is a living embodiment of that. And so when I think of people like Dr. King, Mahatma Gandhi, remember the letter from the Birmingham jail, when Dr. King was under tremendous stress. He was abandoned by his base, and he went into a deep contemplation and prayer. And you know, I remind people that King talked about wanting to live a long life, but being willing to surrender in terms of whatever the universe had planned for. Or when Jesus talked about being, knowing he was going to be nailed up on the cross. It's kind of a disturbing thought. And he says, you know, actually I'm not down for being nailed up on the cross. But he then ended it by saying, not my will, but thy will be done. I'm resting into something beyond myself. I'm certainly resting into something beyond my small egotistical self. That is where I find peace, that I can rest in something larger than that 40 bits of information that I'm processing every second. And so what I want to suggest to you is that those efforts, those experiences of being able to rest into something deep is really the heart of mindfulness, being aware and resting, not in control. And we've noticed for a while that mindfulness, that when you are mindful, you become more effective at social justice. And I'll just share with you, I have some concerns, you know, because now it's like, can we make better soldiers if we teach them how to meditate? You know? I mean, literally, right? You see, it becomes just a technique. Whereas I spent some time in India, I lived in India, I spent some time in ashrams there. I can tell you, this is not just about a technique. This is not just about, and I know that, especially in law school here at Berkeley, we may want to strip mindfulness away from any kind of profound spiritual roots. It is a technique, but it's more than a technique. I think if you really relax, something happens. And I won't tell you what happens because that will spoil it for you. But I hope you'll do it. But I also want to suggest that, so mindfulness is not just informing social justice, that social justice is informing mindfulness. There's a reason why Buddha left his home. It's because he saw people suffering. Not himself. He didn't see himself suffering. He saw other people suffering. He saw people getting old. Not himself. He was a young man. He saw other people getting old. When you read the tradition of Muhammad, or Jesus, it's almost, many of these traditions have a concern about us. And when you read Gandhi, he talks about the inability to separate concern for the world and one's own well-being. And if we reject the notion that the self and other are separated, then the gap between social justice and a deep spiritual practice or a deep mindful practice actually starts to go away. So that's part of the thing that I've sort of been pushing for years, is understanding the deep relationship between social justice and what we call mindfulness. And in doing so, we not only transform the other, but we transform ourselves. And I'm going through these fast. It also means that we need to transform our structures. This is not just about an expression, what happens in between our ears. In fact, one of the sort of counterintuitive things is that the unconscious is actually social. And when two neurons fire together repeatedly, they build a bridge. And those bridges become a network. And those things affect how we see the world. And we also have another name for them. We call them habits. And one reason habits are so hard to break is literally, it's like breaking a bridge. It's like if you don't pay attention, you do it automatically. Where do these things come from? They come from two neurons firing together at the same time. So we see a black man and someone going to jail over and over again at a level, the neurons will create an association between black man and criminality. Not we do it consciously, but we're doing it by a representation over and over and over again. We're creating mental habits. And again, I would say mindfulness is another way to actually give pause to some of those habits, to slow down a little bit, and maybe begin to see them. And it also gives us a chance to think about and talk about sustainability. So in closing, I'll just say part of the thing then is to be able to relax in the presence of the apparent other, to be able to come to terms with it, to be reconnected, or more accurately, to acknowledge our connection with the world. To acknowledge our connection with the world. And a friend was in town this weekend, and I went up to the wine country. It's actually a very nice way to practice mindfulness. But in all seriousness, it's interesting to me, they're explaining the grapes to us, right? And they say, well, the grapes at this level have this characteristics because they are taking stuff from the earth. And you go up, 50 feet, and the grapes are different. So they're constantly interacting with the universe. They're constantly interacting with their environment. And it shows up that if you're mindful wine taster, you can taste the difference between grapes at this level and grapes at this level. They're reflecting the universe. They're reflecting their environment. So are all of us reflecting our environment. We're in constant interaction with that environment. So much so now, they have, and Troy is one of the great thinkers on genetics in the country, and they have something called epigenetics, which means that basically that even in uterus, the fetus is actually interacting with the body and changing the structure of the genes by relating to the environment even while it's in the womb. And so the separation between us and others, separation between the environment and us is actually false. And we're seeing it over and over again. And I'll just end with a saying by Don Cherry, who's a jazz musician. He has something, he says that the outside is not, the inside is too. Thank you.
information. And every second of what you just talked about is to pull together some coherent comments is very challenging. But thank you so much. Thank you for your work and your words and blowing my mind. And also, there's so many amazing people here, all of you, and so I really want to open it up too. But I will say a couple of comments, just the things that come up in hearing all of that, which is very rich. So kind of following along with your talk. I love, and I'm so excited to read more about it, this putting the context, putting othering, the belonging and othering in a context of the Enlightenment Project. Because I think a lot, and especially in teaching law students, about how to understand the impulse to other. And to understand it as someone who's been othered and someone who others, as we all do, trying to understand it with some level of compassion so that it's not just a feeling of victim and persecutor. And, because the dynamic in social justice is often to use the exact same rhetoric and just turn it around on whoever was doing the othering to you then other them. And so I tried to understand it in the context of sort of course, as you grow up as a child and beyond that, the people here, there's you, and then there's the you that's your immediate family, and then there's the you that's the people in your neighborhood, and the you that's in your school, and the more people you let into the you are the people that belong. And so there's a way that that you can, and through mindfulness practice too, that you can expand who's in that circle, but the circle's still there. You're just getting more and more people into it. And I feel like you brought a different perspective on that the circle, that there is no circle, or the circle is the boundless universe, but also that isn't just some learned intuitive habit, that is part of the Enlightenment Project, that was a structured way for us to think and to rationalize and to make reasonable the world, to order the world, and that our entire legal system has been built upon that. And so to undo it using those tools doesn't work. So I really appreciated putting that in that context of that being part of a political, philosophical evolution. And then another piece of what you were saying, and I'd love for you to expand on this, is that we're at the end of the Enlightenment Project. And I was thinking about how one thing I've been reading and looking at lately is Sarah Jane Blakemore's Neuroscience, where she did some work on the teenage brain, and then her new work now is this about a dramatic shift that she foresees from left brain thinking to right brain thinking, and left brain thinking being very rational and ordered and male, and right brain thinking being more intuitive and feminine and ecosystems rather than linear systems. And so when I was listening to you talk about that and the end of this Enlightenment Project, I was thinking of her work on the end of a time when, from a total neuroscience perspective of having this rational thought literally dominated by parts of our brain, that there's a natural migration happening to more intuitive and open and collective thought. So you're on to something. This is exciting. I can't wait to see. I hope we're around to see the end of the Enlightenment Project. Let's prepare our children for this. It's super exciting. So I love that, and I'd love to hear. And then I also feel like bringing in how mindfulness practice has, I think really, or at least I hear throughout it, given you the space to even see, to be able to see things in this way that you're presenting, and allowed you that relaxed stance. And I find that is really challenging as social justice advocates, to take what might look like a more relaxed or even compassionate stance, when so much of the way the movement, and as I grew up in the movement for my family, has been fueled by righteous anger and about injustice. And so how you have incorporated what you've learned through this practice to shift from fear really fear and anger being the driving force behind change, to maybe clarity and compassion and community as being it. So those are my observations, and I'm excited to open it up for people's comments and questions. And thank you again so much.
Thank you.
Questions if folks have them. Comments? Your minds are blown too. Okay.
I actually have a question about sort of the process of deconstructing these boundaries between self and other, and how we don't, in doing so, are there things, strategies that you would suggest in not falling into the ideology of, for example, colorblindness, to still being able to recognize that people are situated differently, that there are differences.
Sure. That's a great question.
Great question.
So, and again, some of you may know who are part of various template communities, but that's one of the big issues. It's like, if we are really, whatever, are we transcendent beings, right? Don't we transcend race, gender, color, sexuality? Are we just transcendent beings? My sense, is no. First of all, I would say that it's still kind of, one of the things, and it's tricky to talk about some of this stuff, one of the things is that you're moving beyond a certain kind of dualism. And so in a dualism, we constantly can go back and forth. Is it this or that? There's one expression which is, I think it may have been Thich Nhat Hanh who said, it's not and it's not. And of course, or you think of the Zen koan, you sort of tie up the mind trying to think that through. And I think part of what is not to just think it through, but to actually experience it. And so I would say that and I've talked about this in some of my work, and that the context that we find ourselves in, the soil that we're growing from, we really are growing from it. And it's from that soil that we get to something else. So we don't start off by rejecting, that we relax into, and so I think a lot of people approach things as rejecting, right? I think I don't teach undergraduates as much as I used to, but when I used to teach undergraduates, they would oftentimes come to class and they would be like, I can't stand my family, the high school I went to, the town I went to, my family, I want to reject all of that. And I used to say, so if you reject all that, who are you? Your family, your town, your community, in that Zen koan, without your language, without your religion, who are you? And so I don't think, from my perspective, it's not to reject it. It's to be present and embrace it, and it takes you someplace. And of course, the idea of blindness, right, is sort of antithetical to awareness. That we actually want to be aware and present with people and present with ourselves. And I think that when there's another presentation I hear where I talk about different ways of not knowing. And some things we don't know because they are embarrassing. It's like if I'm feeling uncomfortable around, if I have a value of treating all people the same, and yet I'm reacting to someone at some level, I'm uncomfortable with them, it actually creates an internal tension, right? So my desire then is to deny that the person's otherness matters. And so it's like, I didn't even know, Jose, that's a Latino? God, who would talk? So I was actually in a store the other day, and a woman was helping me buy something. Actually, she was not helping me. She was supposed to be helping me buy something. But I walked up behind her and I said, could you help me? And she turned around, and this is my interpretation, this is my story. And so she saw this black man, and she said, can I help you? Literally, she was I was like, stand still, that would help. So my guess is she was not conscious of it, that this was her acting at an unconscious level to all the things that she admired. So I think part of the things is relaxing, and even accepting that we have these biases, that they are part of society, that these are sort of things that are in the environment, and we need to be aware of aware how they work. The final thing I'll say on that is that at the neural level, we actually can test people's racial sensitivity, gender sensitivity, and it's actually quite profound. It's actually even more present in white Americans than in people of color. less than fully conscious level, all kinds of bells and whistles go off at a conscious level because it's sort of interpreting what is getting from the environment.
There's now more than 2 million points of information on the implicit bias test out of Harvard at this point. I mean, it's a huge amount of information.
Right.
That all kind of point to the same
Right.
things.
You want to call people?
Sure.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the soldiers, for example, in terms of the use of mindfulness to help soldiers do something which is going to commit extreme acts of violence and harm on other people. And I guess just expanding that, I think mindfulness is an incredibly powerful thing for all people to engage in, but how to reconcile that with, I mean, even in the context of like, I don't know, ExxonMobil or like a large corporation having its employees practice mindfulness to like be better at their job, which might inflict a lot of harm on people, and how to think about that and reconcile it.
Yeah, it's actually tricky on a number of levels, because I think sometimes not just think of mindfulness, think of yoga, think of Tai Chi, and many of these quote-unquote practices. And again, not that I became an expert, but I did live in India for a while, and I can tell you that many of so yoga actually means union, it's connecting. And so it wasn't just to get, how do I become a better athlete? How do I get rid of this cold? It really was tied to some profound tradition, union, connecting with the universe, connecting with God or whoever. And we sort of we think we are not religious. A friend of mine, David Lloyd, said, secularism is religion without God. I mean, that we really have many of the same trappings, but we are comfortable talking about it, especially people who are left of center. And so we think of, okay, just breathe and watch your breath. You don't have to care about anything. This is just going to make you a better soldier. I think at some level, it's, and Marx talks, not Marx, but Weber talks about means without end. You can introduce people to it as a technique. I believe at some level that if we're profoundly mindful, the work gets done. That something actually happens. It is transformative. That we don't have to start off being transformed. But I also think that sometimes we try to cabin it. It's again, we're trying to build a park. It's like mindfulness is that scary stuff. We're going to make it safe. You're going to be the same person you were when you came in, and you're going to be just as able to kill people, only better, right? So I'll share with you. You talked about anger. When I was in my 20s, I had a lot of anger. I was just, political anger, and it wasn't, Dr. King talks about righteous indignation. But this wasn't righteous indignation, this was just indignation. I was just pissed, I can be pissed at anything, right? And I didn't realize a lot of it was me. It's like the world, it just sucked. And I was just, so I went on a long retreat in India. I don't even know why I did it, but anyway, I was there on this long retreat in India. And I was sitting with a Goenka, who was a fairly famous Buddhist teacher, and we could only eat one meal a day. And the last meal was like 11 o'clock. We woke up at like 4:30. We sat, and then about 11 o'clock we ate, and that was it. Then they put all the food away. And Goenka was a big man, and my mind was just racing. It was like, and then once every 4 or 5 days you had a session with Goenka. And so, and my mind's like, one meal a day, I know this guy's sneaking back. All day, meet up day, and he just one meal. It's like, he's a fraud. It's like, it's like, and then so when you met him, he said, so how's your sitting going? And I want you to open any problem you want to talk to me about? And it's like, I'm not talking to this guy. He's a fraud. And he said, I guess he picked up on that I was being a little whatever. So he said, if I've done anything to hurt you or offend you, consciously or unconsciously, I ask you to forgive me. And I just started crying. And when I went back to sitting, I just sat, and the anger that was there, I literally, and I don't know, this thing where you can see what you hear, or you can taste what you smell, or your senses get crossed. So I was seeing the anger, I was seeing colors, I was seeing, and I just sat with it. I wasn't trying to get rid of it. I was just sitting with it. I was just, and I never, it was a transformation. That's what I'm getting to. And it was a transformation that was so strong that when I finished, my friends noticed it. And I was like, oh man, you're gonna become one of those, spiritual woo-woos, aren't you? You can't do social justice unless you have the anger. You gotta be angry. And I said, I think I still can. And I believe that it can be done out of love, out of a deep connection with someone rather than just anger. But I say all that to say, that wasn't my goal. My goal wasn't going to this long retreat so I could get rid of my anger. And that I think if we really are mindful, something happens that we don't have control over. And so part of it is having some faith in that. I think we have time for one more.
A couple more.
So I spend a fair amount of time thinking about justice, social justice. And one of the things that has troubled me is that social justice, to me, seems like a form of othering. And I would like you to speak to that.
Well, I'm not exactly sure what you mean, but I can speak to it.
Well, I mean that it is, to put, I think, an adjective on anything is somewhat othering. Now, we have economic justice, and reproductive justice, and social justice, and transformative justice, and it seems like it could be more divisive than unifying. That's something that I'm trying to work out for myself. That social justice seems part of it is kind of less unifying and more divisive.
Well, I guess I would say two things. One would be how you approach it, but two, I think of social justice as the public face of love. Plus you can be doing things for all kinds of reasons, right? You can be doing the right thing for the wrong reason, or the wrong thing for the right reason. But I think if it's grounded in that, and again, so I think the othering process that's really supercharged by the enlightenment is just a destructive process that we engage in all the time. And I was telling Charlie that I asked my dad, I said, so what is death? And I would say to you from a Christian perspective, but my dad doesn't think of his perspective as a Christian perspective. He thinks of it as, whatever. So anyway, I said, so what is death? What is sin? And he said, death is separation. And sin is separation. That once we separate or have a separation, and he's a theist, so he would say separation from God, that it's death and sin, and that we're in constant pain. We spend the rest of our existence trying to heal that separation. And to me, that's what social justice can be or should be about, is the recognition of our profound interconnectedness and trying to deal with, and I talk about it in the book, what I call surplus suffering. Because we will suffer, unless we, become enlightened, we will suffer. We'll watch people we love get old, we'll watch people we care about die, we'll watch the world, we'll suffer. But in that, what I call deep ontological suffering, suffering that happens just because we're alive, just because we're conscious in some way, we don't have to be homeless. I mean, I have a house, but people, my family will still die. So we will have suffering. And then there's what I call surplus suffering, where we treat someone bad because of their race or because of their gender, or we make them homeless or we disrespect them. And so to me, social justice begins with, and I'll stop after this one and maybe take one or two more. So I do a lot of work around quote-unquote social justice. I think one way to make sure it doesn't become othering is not to keep it at the heady level. I think we do have to change structures and institutions, but we need to engage with people. We need to engage on the ground at the same time. And so a couple of days ago, and I'm not whatever, I have a lot of clay feet and warts and pimples, so I don't want to project something that I'm not. But I'm coming home in San Francisco, it's a cold night, and there's a homeless guy trying to sleep, and he has a blanket about this big, and the blanket doesn't cover him. And I'm heading back to my apartment, and I'm thinking, it's a cold night, but there are all these shelters, there are all these things, and one person can't fix the problem at that level, and my mind begins blah, 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 blah. And it's like, the guy's cold, so I go in my house and I get a blanket. And I said, it's like, I'm walking back to the guy, and again, my mind, blah, 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 blah. So he's gonna think, oh, you're some liberal jerk, I don't need your blanket. He's gonna, but I give him the blanket and he says thank you. And so I think that we have to make sure that we don't get trapped just at this sort of conceptual level. That if we, and this is what I think that mindfulness can help us with, because it's not just conceptual. So when they do the meta thing of extending oneself, which is a technique, and everything is full of some contradictions, right? I mean, anytime you say something, there's a split, there's a contradiction. So we need to get lost in the words and the thing. The words are pointing to something that can help us, but they can also be a trap.
I wish we had more time, but I want to thank you, John. I want to thank you, Charlie and Swati, for all your incredible work and for the amazingly stimulating conversation. Thank you.